Have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why you went there? Or maybe you've struggled to recall someone's name that used to come so easily. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. It happens to all of us now and then. But when do these little slip-ups become something more serious, something we need to pay closer attention to? That's what we're talking about today. Because when it comes to dementia, the early signs can be so subtle, so easy to brush off, that many people don't notice them until things have progressed. And here's the truth. Catching those signs early, before they become major problems, can make all the difference in maintaining independence, getting the right care, and living a fuller, longer life. In this video, we're going to have an honest and compassionate conversation about 10 early signs of dementia that you should never ignore. Whether you're watching this for yourself, your spouse, or a loved one, you're doing the right thing by staying informed. This isn't about fear, it's about empowerment. When we know what to look for, we can act sooner, and that can lead to better outcomes for everyone involved. Let's start with one of the most overlooked signs, and that's changes in short-term memory. Now, forgetting a phone number or misplacing your glasses once in a while isn't anything to panic about. But if you or someone you love is forgetting recent conversations, appointments, or asking the same question over and over again within a short period, that could be a red flag, especially if it's happening more frequently than it used to. These memory lapses might seem minor at first, but over time, they can grow into bigger gaps that disrupt daily life. What makes this symptom tricky is that it can easily be dismissed as just getting older. And yes, age can cause some natural forgetfulness, but dementia goes beyond that. One viewer once shared with us that her husband started forgetting that their grandchildren had visited just the day before. At first, she thought he was just tired or distracted. But when it happened again the next week, and then again, she knew something wasn't right. That moment of awareness gave them the opportunity to talk to their doctor and begin getting the help they needed. The second sign you should never ignore is difficulty planning or solving problems. Now, think about something as routine as making a cup of coffee. You know where the coffee is, how to measure it, how much water to add, and what buttons to press. But for someone in the early stages of dementia, even that simple task can start to feel confusing. Maybe they forget a step. Maybe they suddenly can't remember which cabinet holds the mugs. Or they get frustrated because they've done it 1,000 times and now something feels off. Another common example, paying bills. If someone who used to handle all the household finances suddenly starts missing payments, making unusual purchases, or having trouble following a monthly budget, that's worth paying attention to. Especially if this person was once very organized. This sign is often brushed off, too, especially by older adults who might just say, "Oh, I've got a lot on my plate," or "I'm just getting forgetful." But when everyday tasks start to feel like puzzles, it's not something to ignore. It's a signal that the brain is having trouble organizing thoughts and following through with steps. Let's talk now about another subtle but deeply meaningful sign, struggling with language. We all have those tip-of-the-tongue moments where we can't remember a word. But if someone is often losing their train of thought mid-sentence, substituting the wrong words without realizing it, or repeating themselves often, that could be a concern. Imagine trying to describe a spoon but calling it that hand food thing, or pausing for long stretches because you just can't find the right word. This doesn't just make conversation frustrating. It can cause people to withdraw from social settings entirely. I once spoke to a gentleman who had been active in his church for years, giving talks and reading aloud. But gradually, he started skipping services. When his wife gently asked why, he admitted he was afraid of stumbling over his words or forgetting what he meant to say. It broke her heart to hear that. But again, having that conversation was the first step in getting clarity and support. Language challenges can also show up in writing. Maybe someone you love used to write thoughtful letters or emails, but now their notes are shorter, less detailed, or full of repeated phrases. These small shifts matter. They may seem harmless on their own, but together, they tell a story about how the brain is coping, or not coping, with its usual communication patterns. Another sign that often flies under the radar is confusion about time or place. This one is particularly unsettling because it can make someone feel lost, even in familiar environments. A person might forget what day of the week it is, or even what month or year it is. They might find themselves unsure of where they are or how they got there, even if it's just their local grocery store or a nearby park. A viewer once messaged me about her mom, who started getting confused on her daily walks. She'd been taking the same route through their neighborhood for over 30 years. But then one day, she didn't recognize a street corner, and another day, she couldn't remember which house was hers. These kinds of moments can be incredibly scary, not just for the person going through them, but for their family, too. And this confusion doesn't only happen outdoors. It can happen right in your home, like suddenly forgetting which drawer holds the silverware, or waking up in the night and thinking it's morning. These moments of disorientation, especially when they start piling up, deserve real attention and care. So far, we've talked about changes in memory, problem-solving, language, and orientation. These early signs may seem small at first, but they're powerful indicators that something in the brain is changing. And here's the hopeful part. Recognizing them early opens the door to meaningful support, whether that means seeing a doctor, making lifestyle changes, or simply getting more understanding from those around you. Let's keep going, because the next signs are just as important. We're going to continue this journey together and shed light on the changes that often go unnoticed until it's too late. One of the more surprising early signs of dementia is something most people don't usually associate with memory loss: poor judgment. And no, we're not talking about forgetting to bring an umbrella when it rains. We're talking about decisions that seem wildly out of character, even a little risky. Imagine someone who's always been careful with their money suddenly starts giving away large sums to strangers, falling for obvious scams, or buying unnecessary things on a whim, like 5 new toasters or dozens of the same item from a TV shopping channel. Or someone who used to be very aware of safety now leaves the stove on, forgets to lock the front door at night, or goes outside in freezing weather without a coat. These decisions don't come from carelessness. They come from changes in the brain that affect reasoning and awareness. One woman I spoke with told me her father, who'd been a no-nonsense kind of guy his whole life, started giving away cash to anyone who asked. He'd never been that trusting before. It turned out, it wasn't generosity. It was dementia quietly changing how his brain processed risk and trust. Another early sign that people often overlook is withdrawal from work or social activities. When someone who used to love card games, church meetings, or chatting on the phone begins to pull away, it's easy to think they're just feeling tired or down. But sometimes, the real reason is fear or embarrassment. When memory starts slipping or conversation becomes harder, many people begin avoiding situations where those difficulties might show. You might hear phrases like, "I'm just not in the mood," or "I don't really feel like going out today." But if that becomes a pattern, if your mom stops attending her weekly knitting circle, or your uncle suddenly stops calling, even though he used to check in all the time, pay attention. It might be more than just mood. Isolation often deepens cognitive decline, so catching this early is important. Staying socially active and mentally engaged is one of the best ways to support brain health. And now, let's talk about something that many families notice but hesitate to bring up: changes in personality or mood. Dementia doesn't just affect memory. It can also alter the way someone behaves or feels. A person who was once cheerful and easygoing might become anxious, suspicious, or even irritable without much reason. I remember a gentleman telling me about his wife, who had always been calm and kind-hearted. But then, slowly, she began accusing neighbors of stealing things, even when nothing was missing. Or she'd get angry over small misunderstandings. It didn't make sense at first, but those were early signs that her brain was struggling, not with logic, but with emotional regulation. And it's not always anger or suspicion. Some people become unusually quiet, tearful, or depressed. Others become impulsive, doing things they never would have done before, like shouting in public or saying inappropriate things without realizing it. These changes can be confusing and even hurtful, especially to close family members. But it's important to remember, it's not the person, it's the disease. And recognizing that helps us respond with more patience and compassion. Another subtle sign that often gets missed is trouble with spatial awareness or visual processing. That sounds technical, but it shows up in very real ways. A person might start having trouble judging distances, like pouring juice and missing the glass, or tripping over rugs or furniture more often. Driving can become difficult because turns, traffic signs, or even parking become confusing. A viewer once told me her brother, who'd been driving for over 50 years, started having small accidents, scraping the mailbox, backing into things, misjudging red lights. He brushed it off as bad luck or poor weather. But when it kept happening, they realized it wasn't the road. It was how his brain was interpreting what he saw. Even reading can become harder. Not because of eyesight, but because the brain starts struggling to make sense of what the eyes are taking in. A person might find it hard to follow a line of text or confuse similar-looking letters. If you notice that someone is suddenly avoiding books or newspapers they used to enjoy, or if they seem unsure navigating stairs or familiar places, that's something to look into. And let's not forget about something so basic, yet deeply personal, daily hygiene. When someone begins to neglect grooming, forgets to brush their teeth, bathe, or change clothes, it might be more than just a lazy day or forgetfulness. They might honestly not remember when they last showered or feel overwhelmed by the steps involved in getting dressed. A daughter once told me that her mother, who'd always prided herself on her appearance, began wearing the same outfit for days, even sleeping in it. At first, the daughter felt hurt. Was her mom just giving up? But when she gently asked, her mother looked confused. She hadn't even realized she was doing it. It was then they both realized something deeper was going on. When dementia begins to affect these personal habits, it's often because the person can no longer remember the steps involved or lacks the motivation due to changes in the brain. It's not laziness, it's a symptom. And when caught early, gentle support and structure can help maintain independence and dignity. These signs, poor judgment, social withdrawal, personality changes, visual issues, and neglecting hygiene, may each seem unrelated. But when you step back and look at them together, a picture starts to form. And in that picture, there's one thing that matters more than anything else: awareness. Because when we know what to look for, we can act. We can talk to a doctor. We can build support. We can bring compassion to a situation that often feels confusing and overwhelming. And most importantly, we can remember that a diagnosis, if it comes, doesn't define a person. It's just a starting point, a place from which we can plan, adjust, and still live a life full of love, connection, and purpose. Let's keep going, because there are a few final signs we haven't covered yet, and they're just as important to understand as the ones we've talked about so far. Another sign that often sneaks up on people is trouble with familiar tasks. I'm not talking about learning something brand new. We all take time to get used to modern technology or a new remote control. This is about everyday routines that a person has done for years suddenly becoming confusing or frustrating. Maybe your spouse used to make the morning coffee like clockwork, but now they forget how to measure the grounds or which buttons to press on the machine. Or your neighbor, who used to bake the best lemon cake in town, now has trouble remembering the recipe, despite having made it 100 times. They might leave out ingredients or mix things up in a way that just doesn't make sense. You may even notice they start a task, like folding laundry, but abandon it halfway through because they're no longer sure what to do next. It's easy to brush these things off as just getting older, but when they begin affecting daily life, and especially things that were once second nature, that's a red flag. The key here is change. A sudden or progressive shift in how someone handles familiar activities, like paying bills, cooking, using a phone, or driving a route they've known forever, deserves attention. Closely tied to that is difficulty with language. Most people over 60 occasionally forget a word. It happens to all of us. But with early dementia, it's more than that. Someone might stop mid-sentence and completely lose track of what they were saying. Or they might repeat themselves in the same conversation, asking a question they already asked 5 minutes ago. Sometimes the words come out jumbled, or they'll substitute odd or incorrect words without realizing it. I remember a man telling me about his wife calling a television a wall box and not being able to find the right words for simple things, like spoon or sock. These aren't just slips of the tongue. They're signs that the brain is struggling to connect language and meaning. This can be frustrating not only for the person experiencing it, but also for loved ones trying to understand what's going on. It's important to respond with patience, not correction. Instead of saying, "You already asked me that," you might try something softer, like, "We talked about that earlier, but let's go over it again." That small shift in tone can preserve dignity and reduce anxiety. Then there's something that many people notice early on but don't know how to interpret: misplacing things and not being able to retrace steps. Sure, everyone misplaces their keys once in a while, but people in early stages of dementia often put things in truly unusual places, like the remote control in the fridge or their watch in the sugar bowl. Then, when they can't find it, They may accuse others of stealing or hiding their belongings. This isn't because they're paranoid by nature. It's the brain trying to make sense of confusion. They honestly don't remember putting the item there and may feel embarrassed, confused, or even afraid. For families, this can be one of the most challenging symptoms because it creates tension and hurt feelings when someone you love starts pointing fingers or imagining things that aren't true. If you notice this happening regularly, or if it starts causing distress, that's a big sign it's time to talk to a professional. Early diagnosis makes a real difference. There are resources, medications, and strategies that can help slow down progression and give families time to prepare and adapt. And finally, one of the most overlooked, but deeply personal, signs of early dementia is a growing sense of confusion about time and place. It might start small, like forgetting what day it is or mixing up the order of events. But over time, it can become more serious. A person might think it's morning when it's night, or forget entirely where they are and how they got there, even in familiar settings. I once heard from a family whose father went out for his usual morning walk around the neighborhood, something he'd done for years. But this time, he got lost 3 blocks from home. He didn't recognize the street signs, couldn't remember which way to turn, and when someone asked if he was okay, he became defensive and scared. That kind of disorientation is more than just forgetfulness. It's a deep internal confusion that comes with dementia's progression. What makes this so dangerous is that it puts people at real risk. Getting lost, wandering, even exposure to bad weather or busy roads. These things happen more often than you'd think, and they can be terrifying for families and loved ones. Now, if any of this sounds familiar, either in yourself or someone you love, I want to reassure you, you are not alone. And noticing these changes doesn't mean life is over. In fact, catching the signs early gives you more time, more control, and more options. There are doctors who specialize in memory issues. There are support groups for both patients and families. And there's a lot of new research being done to support brain health and slow down cognitive decline. Most importantly, if you or a loved one is experiencing any of these signs, don't ignore them. Don't let fear or pride stand in the way of getting help. Early action can lead to better outcomes and more peace of mind. Remember, our brains deserve just as much care and attention as our hearts, bones, and joints. And just like we do exercises to stay strong or eat well to manage blood sugar, we can also make choices that support brain health, like staying socially active, eating nourishing foods, keeping mentally engaged, and getting regular checkups. Before we go, I want to leave you with a gentle reminder. Noticing changes in memory, language, or behavior isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of awareness. It means you're paying attention. You care. And that's the first and most important step to protecting the people you love and yourself. If today's video helped you understand the early signs of dementia a little more clearly, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Whether it's a story from your own life or a question you've been holding on to, your voice matters, and it might help someone else feel a little less alone. Please give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to Primetime Wisdom for more heartfelt, practical advice on aging well and living with joy, strength, and dignity. You're doing great, and I'm so glad we could share this time together. Here's to living fully, bravely, and wisely at every age.